Hello guys, now today's video is going to be a look at the ill-fated 32-bit powerhouse that was the Panasonic 3DO. Now I know that quite famous YouTubers have done videos on the 3DO before, most notably AVGN did a not too complimentary video on it about 4 or 5 years ago. However, I did kind of want to record my own personal perspective and kind of a UK look at the Panasonic 3DO. As growing up, this was a console that I really did crave. And that was kind of to be expected really, because if you believe the media, you know, the TV shows and the magazines at the time, they're all making out like the 3DO was going to be the next big video game system of the mid-1990s. Kind of what Sony went on to achieve with the PlayStation, as we all know, because Sony got it completely right, and unfortunately 3DO got it drastically wrong. So I do originally remember hearing about the 3DO, just after that kind of awkward period when the 16-bit consoles were starting to look quite old, and we had stuff like the Amiga CD32 on sale, and the Atari Jaguar was out by then, and it was kind of this crossover period between the 16 and 32-bit systems. And the 3DO, first time I saw it, I think it was demoed on the Kids Games TV show, Bad Influence it was called, a show that I watched religiously back in the early 90s. It was on TV every week, and there's also another show called Games Master. Anybody that grew up in Britain in the early to mid-90s who loved video games watched both of those shows every week. And I remember them actually demoing the Panasonic 3DO and referring to it as kind of the first of the super consoles. That was the tag that they gave the 32-bit generation. And it was kind of, at the time in the magazines, described as an arcade experience in your home. Now, the idea behind the 3DO was that it would not only be a game system, but it would also be an interactive multiplayer, they called it at the time. As you remember, back in the early 90s, there was kind of this full motion video craze that went on. And it was just after stuff like the Philips CDI and the Commodore CD-TV, where companies had it in their head that consumers wanted an interactive set-top box in their living room where they could look at encyclopedias and watch movies and all that kind of thing on it. So the 3DO did kind of inherit a bit of that. I mean, at its heart it was really a game system, but also they were focusing this as a living room device that would also be a media player. So there was kind of a lot of that kind of multimedia hangover included in the 3DO's philosophy. Now, unfortunately, where they really went wrong with the 3DO was the licensing of the system. You look at other big companies like Nintendo and Sony. Their philosophy was to sell their hardware really cheap and then claw back their development costs by charging quite extortionate fees to software publishers. You know, if you want to make a game for the Super Nintendo, you'd have to give Nintendo a pretty hefty fee to license your game to be released on their platform. The idea behind 3DO was it was a hardware specification that anybody could build a system on. They kind of wanted it to be like VHS was for videos, you know, where you could license the VHS spec and any company could make a system. So anyone could make a 3DO platform device, providing you paid a licensing fee to the 3DO company. Unfortunately, that meant that they weren't clawing back the development costs on software. Instead, the hardware costs got passed on directly to the consumer. So depending on who you believe, the 3DO was released at originally, Trip Hawkins reckons it was $599. I've seen some adverts that say it was actually $699. So you look at that in today's money, we're talking like 22, 23 years ago. You probably look at like $2,000 now. So it was double the price of stuff like the Super Nintendo and the 3DO. And really, unless you're a rich kid, nobody had the money to pay that kind of extortionate fee for a games console. So in the end, they kept them on sale for, I think it was about 3 years. And they did gradually get cheaper. But by that point, stuff like the Sony PlayStation and the Sega Saturn and eventually the N64 had come out, and kind of everyone had lost interest in the 3DO by that point. It was seen as yesterday's news. So it was pretty sad really, and I'm going to show you a little clip now of an episode of Bad Influence here in the UK where the 3DO was originally demoed that I still remember watching to this day.
And now a look at what some people think will be the future of games consoles, 3DO. If you're not familiar with the system, it's a CD-based machine. It'll play photo CDs, music CDs, and soon you'll be able to get movies on CD for it too. But it's really catching people's imagination as a sophisticated games console. The system's due to be launched in this country next April. It will probably cost around £500, which is a lot for a games console, but the manufacturers are hoping that you will buy this instead of buying a photo CD and a CD player as well. We'll report on 3DO's progress next year.
So as I mentioned a moment ago, there were actually a few variations of the 3DO made by different companies, but this was the original 3DO, the first one that came out, made by Panasonic, and the model number was the FZ1, or if you're American, FZ1. The 3DO Interactive Multiplayer. Now, I always really liked the design of this console. As I mentioned, it was a pretty expensive piece of kit, but I think it does kind of warrant it in the look, really. It looks like a pretty high-end piece of home theatre equipment from the early 90s. So on the front here, we have I think it's a dual-speed CD-ROM drive in there. There's also a controller port on the front. Now, this actual system only had one controller port on it. I'll explain why in a moment, but basically you daisy chain them together. I'll give you a little demo of the controller in a sec too. We have a power button here and a disk drive tray eject button. Not a lot on the right side of it. There is actually space for a fan there that some FZ1s actually had, but mine doesn't include a fan for some reason. So we'll look inside it and explore that a bit more in a moment. Now, looking on the back of it here, they really have kept it quite minimal. There's not really too much on it. If we look here, there's the usual composite video ports here for video and stereo audio. We have an S-video out here too and an RF port. There's also a little port here marked expansion, and there's a bigger one on the side of the unit too. Now, I'm not sure whether many expansions were ever released for the FZ1, but I do know there was a MPEG video cart released. You know, it's pretty common with systems of the time. I know the Amiga CD32 had one, the Sega Saturn did, so as I mentioned before, this was really designed to be a bit of home theatre equipment as well as a games console. So the idea was that you could watch video CDs on your Panasonic 3DO in your living room. So that's a look at the outside of it. We'll move the camera up slightly. So you can see the top of my 3DO is quite scratched and beaten up. However, this is not my main 3DO. If you look over to the right here, on my desk permanently set up, I do have another 3DO underneath my Mega CD and Mega Drive that is always there and always ready to play. So you can never have too many 3DOs, that's what I say. It does mean, though, I can actually show you this unit without having to rip all of my system to bits and, you know, strip it all down and everything. And actually inside this 3DO, I've already taken out all the internal shielding and took about 25 screws out of it. So that does mean giving you a overview of what's inside it is going to be a lot easier. So if we take the lid off there, you can see the CD-ROM drive here that has some shielding on as well. Back then they were really sensitive about shielding all the internal components. I think it might have been a little bit more tougher legislation in America, the FCC. I don't think you get as much these days, but there was about 25-30 screws had to take out of this. So if we remove the CD-ROM drive and we'll put that to the side, you can see the main board here. And it is quite a simplistic design, really. We'll start from the left here. We've got the PSU, the power supply, which is actually built in. It's quite nice to see a console with an internal power supply, as a lot these days have those ugly kind of power bricks or wall warts that you need to use that weigh a ton and, you know, they're cumbersome. It is quite tidy inside this unit though. It's all kind of built in there, and then it connects into the board here. I did mention a moment ago that my 3DO doesn't have an internal fan, but if you look there, there is actually a mount for the fan there, so it does look like it was designed to have one. And I originally thought that maybe the last owner of this system, because it was a second-hand unit that I bought, maybe repurposed the fan for something else, or maybe it broke and they removed it. Although, if you look on the board there is a header for it, but there is no connector actually soldered to the board, so it doesn't look like there was ever a fan in this unit. And I've checked inside my other 3DO, and that's exactly the same. So whether or not it was just in the American units, or maybe they improved the design, it didn't need as much cooling, I'm not sure, but yeah, there you go. If anyone knows, leave a comment. Maybe I will fit a fan to this at one stage though, because, you know, I think if it was designed to have one, maybe it should. Looking around the board, we've obviously got the power unit, kind of goes into the board here, the caps and everything are here for that, and then we've got some RAM here. Now it does have 2 megabytes of system RAM and 1 meg of video RAM, and the 2 chips here are what really power the 3DO. These are the dual GPU units, 2 custom chips, and as with a lot of systems back in the era, kind of the late 80s, early 90s, really based on the Amiga probably, they did have some kind of, you know, cute little custom chip names. This one here is called Madam, and this one here is called Clio. I had to look at it on the chip, so we got Madam and Clio. And as far as I can remember, the only other system that I can remember, definitely of this era, that had dual GPUs was the Sega Saturn. And there's also a video encoder chip here as well. I did mention before you can get like an MPEG video cart and everything for this too. Moving around the board a bit, we have the logic board there for the controller. So that's on a separate board for some reason. Maybe there was a few revisions of that at some stage. And here we have a battery on board, and there's also a chip that drives it here. That's because the 3DO actually has some SRAM to hold save games. It's not very big though, you can only hold about 4 or 5 inside it. The most interesting thing on this board though, apart from these two custom chips, is the CPU, which is this tiny little chip we've got here. What's kind of cool about it is that it's an ARM chip. Obviously you know that ARM is the leading processor architecture in this day and age. Pretty much every smartphone and stuff like the Raspberry Pi and the Ouya and all that are powered by ARM. At this kind of stage, I think, 1993, it was probably still kind of owned by Acorn, or definitely they had some big involvement in it, as it was used in the Acorn Archimedes machines originally. And this is a ARM 60 architecture running at 12.5 megahertz. So, you know, back in 1993 when this board was designed, RISC was kind of the next big thing. Everyone said, you know, RISC is going to change everything, if you remember the movie Hackers. So it was quite cool to see, you know, an early ARM-based CPU here. So that's kind of a look at the board. What I'm going to do now is put it back together, or actually fire up my other 3DO, and we'll do a little demo of the system in operation. So I'm going to be capturing all the footage that I get of the software titles on my actual Panasonic 3DO console. As rather than using emulation that is still a little bit glitchy in places, I prefer to use the real hardware. As with most systems of this era, you know, they do predate high definition by quite a few years. Watching them on a modern 1080p LCD TV shows up all the artifacts, you know, pixels look really blocky. I've done videos on this before, but really, for the authentic experience on these SD consoles, you need an old school CRT. That's the display technology that all the games and the system was designed to use. In my opinion, if you're going to use a modern screen and not the authentic thing, you may as well just use emulation. Now, there will be people that will ask, how am I going to capture the footage from a real 3DO? Well, I'm actually using the Elgato Game Capture HD, which has got an S-Video input. So that means I can have the 3DO on the CRT here, and also being captured on my PC at the same time as well, which lets me actually use the original hardware and the proper controllers too. I did mention these before, that there is only one controller port on the 3DO. Basically, if you want to use two, like a two-player game, it works by just plugging the second controller into the top of the first one. So that does mean, however, if player one is a sore loser, you can obviously just unplug your friend's joypad, if you're a cheating bastard. Right then, I thought the first thing I'd demo is what happens when you first turn on the 3DO without a disc of any description in the drive. You get this intro screen that kind of demos the console's scaling technology. Admittedly, it does look slightly naff by today's standards, but you know, this was kind of impressive stuff back in 1993, this kind of 3D Starfield. Now, while the 3DO did have a few exclusive titles, I think it might be more interesting, being that most people are probably not all that familiar with the 3DO's library, to kind of show you the 3DO ports of some popular games from the era, as there were a lot of games that were released on the 3DO that were also popular on platforms like the Amiga and the Sega Mega Drive that actually had superior ports on the 3DO console. The first one we'll have a look at is Out of This World, as it was known in America and titled on the 3DO, more commonly known in Europe as Another World. Now, the original Amiga version of this was one of my favourite games growing up, so it is really interesting to see the translation to the 3DO, and I've got to say, graphically, it is streets ahead of the Amiga. And also you notice a few subtle differences, like, extra sound effects in the background, and everything just seems to load a lot faster and be a lot smoother. Let's have a look at the famous Another World introduction sequence here. So we won't watch the entire thing, I'll just skip ahead into the actual game here and just quickly demo the first level, which is really short, but it should give you a nice look at the graphical improvements over the more common Amiga, Mega Drive and Super Nintendo versions of this game. And even the more recent HD updates that were released on Android, the Ouya and stuff like that, I actually kind of wish they'd done a more high definition port of this version because it looks so much better. Now obviously this console was released in 1993 and that did kind of herald the arrival of the full motion video craze. For a couple of years, all game manufacturers who were releasing games on CD were making use of actual video footage, thinking that that would be the future of games. Obviously, as we know now, it only lasted a couple of years with the 3D revolution coming after that. But this is actually probably my favourite version of the game Road Rash. Now it does come complete with a rather cheesy full motion video introduction, but when we get into the game you'll see just how impressive this port of Road Rash actually is. Alright, that was unlucky. This next game is quite a unique little platformer actually. It's called Gex. It was released on a few other platforms, but I think it was initially out on the 3DO. And of course it does come with the obligatory full motion video intro. This one though is quite nicely 3D rendered.
It all started so simply. I had just finished my usual morning routine of nude funkercise, fired up the Barcalounger, grabbed a quick bite to eat, and prepared to watch some serious tube. Little did I know, my snack was sent by Rez.
Obviously, this kind of era, the early 90s, was quite oversaturated with platform games, but I did think this was quite a unique one. Another really good port, actually, to the 3DO was Battle Chess. Now, before this, I played the PC and the Amiga ports of this. However, this one kind of takes it to the next level. Now, I'll just skip forward a little bit so you can actually see one of the death sequences, which, to be fair, was the main reason that we played Battle Chess back in the day. Brutal. Now, another game that was massive on many platforms around this time that I also used to absolutely love was Cannon Fodder, and it did get a really nice port to the 3DO actually, including a rather naff full motion video introduction sequence, as you'd expect.
Never been so much fun. Whoa, never been so much fun. Whoa, never been so much fun. Whoa, never been so much fun. Go up to your brother, kill him with your gun, leave him lying in his uniform, dying in the sun. Whoa.
And when you actually get into the game itself, as you can see these kind of introduction sequences, there is a lot more colour than you got on other platforms. And even when you get into the game itself, it's actually not that bad to control with the 3DO's joypad. I mean, generally with these kind of games, you'd always think it's going to work a lot better with a mouse, but it's actually not too bad at all. And speaking of really popular games that were originally designed to be used with a mouse, I don't think there was a platform in existence either then or now that didn't get a port of Lemmings. And I've got to say, I think they did actually pull off the 3DO version of this really well. Now, it does of course come with a FMV introduction, although I think either my disc or the laser on my 3DO needs cleaning, as it does appear to be a little bit glitchy. And I've played many different versions of Lemmings on consoles, and I've got to say, out of the various systems that expect you to play this with a controller, this version actually controls a lot nicer than systems like the Commodore CD-TV or the Philips CDI that I'd go as far to say is almost unplayable with their controllers. However, on the 3DO it actually works quite nicely, and as you can see there is some improved graphics with the use of more colours on this version. That had to be done, come on. The 3DO in its various guises actually stayed on sale until around late 1996, and in the 2 to 3 years that it was on sale, sales weren't actually that bad considering how expensive it was. They estimate around 2 million of them were sold worldwide during those few years. And there was actually a follow-up system announced in 1995. Now, Trip Hawkins was the original founder of Electronic Arts, and he was the main guy behind the 3DO company, and he announced and demoed the follow-up system, codenamed the Panasonic M2, at E3 back in 1996. And this VHS rip that we're watching at the moment is actually the demo they showed at the presentation, showing off some of the next generation graphics that would have featured on the Panasonic M2. Now the specs for this system were supposed to be around 2 to 3 times more powerful than the Nintendo 64. Unfortunately for 3DO at this stage, by then the PlayStation 1 was really ruling the world, and by 1997 the M2 was officially cancelled. But the story didn't end there actually. There were some dev kits and prototypes that actually made it out there, and believe it or not, the chipset not only made its way into a few arcade machines, I think they were licensed by Konami, there's only around 4 or 5 games ever made for it though, and ATM cash machines and some Japanese coffee machines apparently used the Panasonic M2 technology, which is a pretty sad fate for a system that was born out of such big dreams and had such potential. So if you'd like to try out some 3DO titles for yourself, I definitely recommend it. It is quite a quirky little time capsule of the early 90s before the PS1 came along and dominated the market. You can actually get them off eBay, obviously, they're quite readily available on there. The Panasonic FZ1 model I've got, you can normally get for anywhere between £40 and £100 depending on condition and whether or not it comes with games, controllers and boxes and all that. And there is a pretty decent 3DO emulator available from the website 4do.com. It's an open source emulator based on the 3DO source code. Hasn't been updated since 2013, but last time I tried it, it is pretty stable. So definitely worth a try if you're interested in checking out the 3DO's back catalogue, and obviously you can download the ISOs from the usual locations. Google is your friend. And that's been a look at the Panasonic 3DO. Hope you enjoyed it. Any questions, leave them in the video comments box below, and make sure you join us on Facebook as well. All the links will be in the video description, and I'll catch you next time.